those of you who don't know, when we start the IQDAR seminars, we always say, how is the weather today? And the weather today is hot, and right now, who can believe that it is October, but we have gorgeous, gorgeous trees blooming outside, and the colors are beautiful, and that reflects our mood. Beautiful, you know. So my name is Leonard Jung. I'm an Associate Vice Chancellor here, and more importantly, I'm the Director for the Institute for Integrative and Innovative Research, which we very fondly say I3R. You know, so not I3R, I3R, you know. So I think many of you probably already know, but I want to repeat that. And there are members of the group who are on Zoom who are there, that I3R is driven by purpose. Our purpose is societal impact. And our mission is to pioneer solutions to wicked problems. And how do we do that? We do that through an approach which requires convergence across sectors. So we're not just talking about convergence across disciplines, but we're really talking about convergence across sectors. So maybe academic, industry, government, philanthropy, all of that coming together to address these really difficult big problems that require everybody to come together. And in that doing of addressing problems that are identified from any or all of those sectors is to be able to bring about societal impact. In most importantly, deploying the solutions. We are all very familiar with trying to be entrepreneurial or entrepreneurial or taking things out to commercialization, but that doesn't mean that it gets deployed. And there are many factors that need to come and align to be deployed. So we are very, very fortunate that at the university, we have such an institute that has been formed that is had the bold, that the university took on this bold mission to say, we will try to look at aspects that bring different sectors so that we can get deployment in place. And of course, we want to be the best. You know, there is no doubt about that. So we want to be the best. And so 5 words that you might think about when you think about the institute: integrative, as it's in our name; convergence; economic development, which is also what differentiates this institute from many other institutes that may be for a particular research area or particular thing. We are, by our agreement, mandated to support the economic development and work with industry. And then other thing is that we want our solutions to be at scale. What I mean by that is it's not just local solution, it's not just regional solution, not just state solution, but really national and global. What is clear? And it must make economic sense too. One of the things we said, we take on grand challenges, and part of that grand challenge is integrative health. And when we say integrative health, we don't just mean health. We're not a health institute, but we're taking these big problems. And when we say integrative health, it is health, but it is also societal issues. There is also economic issues. All of that come together in order to give well health to the people. You may be not sick, but keeping well health and maintaining well health. You may be sick and you may be brought back to well health, but it's also well health of the whole ecosystem around it, right? Only then you get good integrative health for people if the entire system it's got well health. And as part of this whole effort, and going back to when this was originally envisioned, things were envisioned as to have a building that gives capabilities and capacity to do many different things that we might be able to address these bigger challenges. We will be long gone, but this building will still be there, right? So it's a framework of thinking for the future, not just for the now, right? But we want to bring the future. And even before I came here, this was Josiah. I saw Josiah somewhere. There is a professor from psychology, right? It was already envisioned that we have a big gap, and one of the ways in which we might understand things, but also to move things towards well health, or especially if people have sickness, to bringing them back to well health. But if you ask Josiah, Professor, Leong, you're looking at neuroeconomics. You're looking at other aspects that you don't think of when you think about MRIs. You think about disease, but you don't necessarily think about all the other things that one might do in perhaps understanding the brain itself, right? So it was envisioned that we would have this capability, which does not exist, of having a magnetic resonance imaging MRI capacity built into this building. How it will all come together, still be thought through. This is several years ago, right? So now we are at this stage where we actually have a building about to open very shortly, and we have got one of the topmost instruments, that is there over here. We have a paucity of experience. We have a paucity of researchers. We have a paucity of educational programming that would go, that would shepherd this, scaffold this, move this, make this the best. But as you can imagine, sometimes if you don't have physical capabilities, it's very difficult to build all the rest of the ecosystem. So this physical capability has allowed us to build that in place. Now, I'm not an MRI imaging person, I dabble with the colleagues for some of that. And none of us are real experts. Perhaps our biggest expert is Dr. Leong here, right? In some ways, but he's also not built things and put there. So we've reached out to people around the country to get guidance, to get input, to say, what should we buy? What should we put in place? How will we manage this? What are we going to do? The whole ecosystem around it, right? And so as part of that, we actually have two world-renowned investigators who are not just researchers. The most important thing is that they have also put in place actual physical assets, operational things, whole aspects of that. So there is a kind of a unique reason why we have the two speakers we have here today. It's not just about what they do for their own research. It is also about what they have done in order to build places, move them to excellence, right? So it is a great pleasure for me that we have got from Laureate Institute, Dr. Martin Paulus and Professor Steffen Sammet from University of Chicago, who are going to give us, it's really too short a time to actually understand research. Half an hour is not enough time for that. It's just I would say it's a sip of a cocktail, and this thing. And so we've invited them to give us a little bit of a flavor of what could happen or how these things could happen. And then later, of course, they're going to get to see what is going on. What have we done with all their advice and input and guidance in actually putting this instrumentation in place? And I'm pretty sure we'll be looking to their guidance for a long time. Laureate Institute is where Professor Leong goes to get his scans done right now. This allows us to think about almost a continuous corridor. They're in Tulsa. We are here, as you know, we have got a corridor that is going, starts to go across. That is a possibility for immediate collaborative effort. Chicago is much further. But as you will hear, as you know, that MR imaging stuff, especially like you look at data and things like that, they have one of the best, MIDRIC is what it's called, the data coalition thing for imaging and data collection and management and use of it. It's globally being used. Besides, I was blown away by how many systems they have and how many more are growing and all of that part. I have had the fortune to go see Laureate Institute. I have not had the fortune of seeing University of Chicago's efforts. So in any case, that is my pleasure. So let me just introduce you more specifically, Dr. Paulus. He's the scientific director and president of the Laureate Institute for Brain Research in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's a distinguished clinician researcher known for his extensive work in the field of mental health. And you know how important that is. With over 700 peer-reviewed publications in top-tier journals, I think he has a Google Scholar H index of 23. Dr. Paulus has advanced our understanding of the neural mechanisms underlying anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders. All really important nationally, but they are really, really affecting many of our things right here in our state. They are a big issue. His research leverages neuroimaging and neuroscientific approaches to enhance clinical assessments, prediction tools, and transdiagnostic interventions, aiming to improve patient outcomes. His work covers multiple themes, including the neural correlates of mental health conditions, the impact of stress and resilience. I like the word resilience. The effects of pharmacological treatments and the development of computational models for personalized psychiatry. And you can see how so many things come together, and it is societal impact. His leadership at LIBOR aims to drive innovative, non-invasive treatment strategies to continue to contribute as a leading figure in mental health research and neurology. Wow.
Wonderful introduction, and also for the vision that you outlined for your institute. So many people came today. I don't know whether I need to wear a microphone or
No, you're good. Yeah, there's mics around.
Okay. Just want to make sure that if somebody is in the ether, that they can hear me. What I want to talk about today, and I'll probably skip quite a bit of this because I don't want to steal the second speaker's thunder and time, is actually something that I've been working on for a number of years. And so this is a topic that I think that we need to understand a lot better than what we currently, than the level of understanding that we currently have. That's why I'm bringing it to you, because I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. So let me just kind of outline what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. Screen media activity in youth. I'll talk about what I mean by screen media activity in a moment. The media and the reality. I'll give you an overview. We did a pretty comprehensive review last year about what's the current status of the field. So I'll talk a little bit about screen media activity, mental health, sleep, and other behaviors, and kind of will suggest that we'll really need a much better contextualized model to fully understand the impacts of screen media on mental health and on well-being. I'll talk a little bit about our studies. I'm probably not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to give you just a flavor. And I'm also telling you a little bit about how we came to be part of the ABCD, and I'll tell you what ABCD stands for and how this works. And that may be something, maybe a model that you might kind of think about for the future as well, as sort of a part of a larger consortium. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about where might we go from here in terms of future studies. So let me delve right in. Also, I want to say, if there are some burning questions, I always prefer that people kind of ask me questions, because then it's more of a back and forth rather than me talking at you. So just feel free at any point in time to bust right in. So let me talk about the scope of the problem. Well, we don't have to really go too far to recognize that digital media is a significant issue. It's been raised by the Surgeon General. There's across the world, the most recent is, Australia is planning to ban social media for teens. There's enormous concern and fear of what the impacts of social media or digital media in general might be on youth health. And it's not just youth, but that's sort of the primary focus has been. And the problem is that we've seen mental health in youth deteriorate. For example, I'm not going to talk too much in detail about it, suicide rates among teens have doubled over the last 15 years, which is really dramatic. I mean, that's a significant change after it's been relatively stable. And of course, we had the pandemic. And with social isolation and loneliness, that has compounded the problem. At the same time, people have been using digital media more and more. We all use it every day. I'll show you just a moment. How far? But of course, correlation doesn't mean causation. And that is where I think we have to be really, really careful. Just because you see two things rise at the same time does not necessarily mean that they're different. But so if you look at the screen media exposure in youth, you can see that between the ages of 13 and 17, over 90% of respondents say that they've been on YouTube, 60% on TikTok. So you can see the type of exposure. Essentially, almost 16% of the same age group say that they're almost constantly on YouTube, TikTok, or Snapchat. 38% is several times a day. But if you look at sort of the net daily, essentially more close to 3 out of 4 teenagers are on one or the other social media app on a daily basis. There are significant gender differences. For example, girls are a lot more on TikTok than boys. It's a little slightly reversed for YouTube. And you can see, and we've done some work that I'm not going to talk about today, that shows that there's a significant difference in the type of digital media consumed by males and females in the ABCD study. And then essentially what I said before, there is a large, the number of teenagers that are almost constantly on some form of digital media has doubled even within the last 10 years. So the trends are clear. More and more youth is on digital media of various types. And of course, the other issues, the digital media landscape is changing dramatically, and it's changing constantly. This was a survey that was done in the Pew Research Foundation in 23. But we know that over the next few years, some of these numbers will be different. Will be different apps, will be different viewing patterns. But what is clear that consumption of digital media is all around us all the time. This is supported by, we have devices. Devices are around us all the time. Between the ages of 13 and 17, 95% of the respondents say that they have access to a smartphone, 90% to a computer, 83% to a gaming console, and 65% to a tablet. We are surrounded by the hardware, we are surrounded by the apps. This is something that has fundamentally changed our lives. And think about it, sometimes it's kind of interesting. If you go back just 2 decades, if you watch old TV shows, for example, maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, there's none of that. There's no digital media. And now you couldn't imagine having a daily interaction without having some form of digital. There's also, some international efforts going on, showing that this is not just true in the United States, this is true everywhere. To some extent, maybe it's a little more extensive in the US, but quite frankly, if you look at other countries, for example, in Europe, there is tremendous amount of use, and also in this particular case, they looked at problematic use. So that raises the question, with all of this surrounding us, with all of this impinging on us, what do we actually know? And I think this is particularly important to take a step back, because we've heard a lot of recommendations by very reputable organizations. Again, the Surgeon General has made that a significant focus of his concern. So we hear from all over the place that we do need to consider digital media and its impact on mental health, and that many problems in youth are then related, well, it's because of social media. But I want to walk you through what we know, and to kind of take the general conclusion. We know much less, and we are much less certain about the link between digital media and mental health than what you think we do. So, there's been a lot of, so we've done a fairly extensive review, as I pointed out. There's been a lot of focus on depression, more recently with anxiety disorders, but also people have recognized that we have to understand the mediating factors. So people are looking at factors like insomnia, loneliness, and self-esteem. So there is some consistency that greater screen time, especially on social media, is linked to higher anxiety and depression, to internalizing symptoms. These are from a developmental perspective called internalizing symptoms. And that effect is stronger in girls or females than it is in males. That has been reasonably well established. But I have to highlight right away that the effect sizes, even on the meta-analytic level, are relatively small. So it's not at all the case that, if you're exposing, if kids are exposed to lots of social media, automatically there's a huge effect on depression and anxiety. There is an effect, and it can be replicated in meta-analysis, but the effect is small. And that's essentially what I said. This has led to some really interesting dynamics in the field, and we've been part of this as part of the review process of even writing this manuscript. There are absolutely dialectic teams or groups in this field. There's a group that is convinced that social media and digital media is a problem, and there's an equally strong and influential group that is convinced that there is no problem. So you can imagine if you publish in this area, you have to be super careful. You really can't overstate on any side. And that tells you that we haven't come to really a deep insight about what are the processes, what are the mechanisms by which digital media might impact the brain and might impact some of these symptoms. There is quite a bit of work that's been done that shows that screen media use, especially video watching and gaming, is linked to shorter sleep duration, longer sleep onset, and more sleep disturbances. And again, now we're beginning to see how essentially engagement in social media or digital media ultimately lead to poor mental health outcomes. And what's important here is immediately you have to think about it's not necessarily the content of what's in the social media or digital media, but it is the fact that it competes with other things that you should be doing, like sleeping, for example. Now, we have seen a significant increase in screen media activity, and that obviously had further impacts on sleep. But it's also interesting if you look at the general behavioral changes that occurred during the pandemic. While we've seen a strong increase, we've also seen sort of a flattening of that over time. So people have adjusted. And again, the important aspect here, there's the effect size are modest, and with some studies even showing minimal reductions. And there are lots of moderating factors that are important, like physical proximity, other physical activities, and also pre-existing mental health problems. There is, an emerging, so the initial literature had focused primarily on sort of the negative aspects. But it is important to recognize that just the absence of something negative doesn't mean that you're feeling good about yourself. So people are now actually looking also at life satisfaction and well-being as sort of the more positive element. And there's some, again, small associations of lower well-being. Again, what most of these studies show that there are significant moderating factors, but the average effect is relatively small. What's interesting, and we've done a little bit of that in ABCD, there's actually not a lot of evidence that there is sort of this displacement hypothesis, that meaning that because you're engaged in digital media, you're not engaged in physical activity. There is a decline in physical activity among youth, but that is independent of digital media activity. So we can't simply say, oh yeah, because you're doing this, you're not doing that. There's actually not a lot of evidence. There is some evidence for poorer diets, higher body mass index, and so that may have to do more with dietary issues, not so much with physical issues. The same thing, the impact on screen media activity on academics is also mixed. It depends on what types of screen media. So there's been an association, again, not causation, but there's been an association with increased television watching and poorer academic performance. But there's been minimal directional effects with overall screen time. The association, when they were found, were more probably associated with pre-existing condition, not caused. Here, for example, is one study that we looked at that shows that with increased screen time, there's a mild increase in internalizing problems. This study really didn't find too much in terms of externalizing, but there's some other comorbid problems. This was a study that basically tried to see whether there is at any age, whether there is a difference in terms of greater digital media consumption and life satisfaction. And these lines and these gray or these shades around these lines indicate the regression coefficient, identifying the relationships with the error of that regression coefficient. And if you look overall, this is the zero effect. If you look overall, there isn't much of an effect. They've made some case that maybe in some age groups, but it's very tenuous. So this is all based on really large data sets. So again, it's to highlight here that the average effect is actually quite minimal. There are many moderators that people have identified. The type of screen media activity, there are sex differences, there's strong socioeconomic status differences, there's parental influence, there's life context that affect the relationship between digital media and outcomes. There is a literature that shows that, for example, parental psychological problems, socioeconomic status, unfortunately mostly lower socioeconomic status, and adverse childhood experience can increase the association between excessive screen time and negative outcomes. There's also a relationship between those individuals who tend to engage in less physical activity and have a greater negative outcomes associated with screen media activity. But it's not because they're not doing physical activity, as I said before, because there's relatively little evidence for this displacement. So this was sort of the status of the field, and we started to look into the brain. You were actually our study with the ABCD data set was one of the first, and I want to just highlight that a little bit. But even looking at it since, there's no one brain spot that you could say is associated with screen media activity. So we can't say, oh yeah, that activates this brain area, or it just doesn't work that way. It's really a broadly distributed brain network. There are some associations in terms of brain structures, and I'll tell you a little bit about them in a moment. And the areas that have been implicated are interesting. The reward processing areas, there's inhibition, and also some emotional regulation areas. But again, a lot of this is also influenced by context, like family environment, socioeconomic status. So let me kind of actually, I'm not going to go too much into the details here. So one thing that we proposed, and I think this is a good kind of conceptual overview, is that you cannot look simply at digital media activity and the brain, or digital media activity and outcomes in isolation. You really have to look at it within a systems framework. So we used this framework that was originally developed by Bronfenbrenner. It goes way back into the 70s of the last century. And the idea was that when you are looking at a behavior, you need to look at the behavior within the context of various systems. He called it like the micro, meso, exosystem, and macrosystem. And he also added later on the chronosystem. But the way to think about this is these are all a moderating influence. So the microsystem is, for example, in this particular case, what kinds of screen media activity are you engaged in? The mesosystem might be the family, your friends, how much parental monitoring is going on. The exosystem is more the general economic status, neighborhood characteristics, community resources, and then of course there's the macrosystem that goes into like socio-cultural, socio-political domains. And then you have to think of all of these systems are not static. They're changing over time. And the reason why this could be is sort of a useful way to think about it, because if you're trying to develop models, quantitative models, then really the right way to do this is to build models with these factors in mind as moderating influences on your outcome variable. So let me talk a little bit about screen media in the brain. This is work that we've done over the last few years using the ABCD study. So let me tell you about the ABCD study. The ABCD study, or Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, is a study that was started now almost 10 years ago, and is a consortium of different sites across the country. These are all the different sites. And there's a coordinating site, and then there's a data management site. And the coordinating and data management site is in San Diego. And then you see all these different dots. And interesting enough, we're sort of the lonesome middle dot, which is that's where we are. That's Laureate. That's Tulsa. Now, the way we got into this, of course, is that I was originally at UCSD, and I still had some contacts at UCSD. And so when there was an initial interest by the National Institute of Health for doing a study like this, I joined the consortium relatively quickly, and we were fortunate as a consortium to be awarded this 10-year grant. We're now in the 8th year, and the hope is that there will be what's called an ABC 2.0, which is trying to follow these now young adults into the third decade. So let me tell you a little bit about the study. So the study started by recruiting 11,000 kids aged 9 to 10. And then, so these were recruited within a 2-year time window. And then they went through a whole bunch of assessments. Self-assessments, interviews, behavioral tests, but also imaging. And then every year they do a short behavioral and self-assessment and parental assessment. And then every other year we scan these kids. So they've now been scanned 3 times. Starting the 4th scan. Eventually they'll have 5 scans over 10. Actually 6 scans over 10 years, because they'll be scanned at the very end again. So this is basically the timeline. We're now at we just started year 8, which is where we are now. And the study is planned to go to 2027. And we're hoping to essentially get this reviewed. Again, there's a lot of data. Now, the cool part of the ABCD study, it is accessible to every researcher, or any researcher anywhere who writes a protocol, who basically has a reasonable hypothesis, reasonable kind of thoughts about it, which is enormous. It's from my perspective, it's a quintessential example of community science. We are the collecting sites as the 22 sites, but we're providing data that can be used by people everywhere. That's the great part. The difficult part is we are a jack of all trades, but a master of none. And the reason for that is because we cover so many different areas, right? So it's not just screen media activities, it's a little slice of what is being covered. You can see the other slices there. So oftentimes it can be frustrating, because you'd like to know more specifically about a certain topic, but we don't have that data. So when we started, the assessment of screen media activity was even sparser than what it is now. Now, actually, they've expanded it quite a bit. They're also doing direct monitoring of the digital devices. So it's a lot more granular than what it was when we first started. So when we first started, we basically just had the screen time survey assessment. And this was done, basically you can see the questions, and this was done separately for typical weekday and typical weekend. And it was sort of, like 30 minutes or less, an hour, 2 to 4 hours. And it was very, very coarse. But that is all we had. So what we did is, and I'm going to just walk you through this briefly. So what ABCD does, it does both structural imaging and functional imaging. Structural imaging is basically is trying to get a sense of the structure of the brain. How much white matter, how much gray matter, how thick the gray matter is, how curved these sulci and are, and so it gives you a whole bunch of measures that are specifically that are for particular brain areas. And so we use this structural characteristic. And then ask the question, is there any structural characteristic associated with the amount of self-reported screen time? And what you see here is one such assessment. I'm not going to go into the detail of the statistical tool, but it's one such assessment where you see this. And there were a number of these associations. For most associations, there was absolutely no relationship to like physical or psychological symptoms. But in this particular case, it was. And it was in such a way that for both males and females, greater relationship between changes in these areas and screen media activity was associated with more externalizing. And slightly more, although not significantly more, internalizing as well. This is another way of showing this. So this was our early study where we showed that we could explain a certain amount of variance, that there was some associations, but the associations, if you look at the effect size, they're very, very small. And there was some other association, which I didn't show you, with some forms of IQ as measured by the NIH toolbox. We took that as, so one way to think about it, why would that be? Well, if you engage, so the areas that were affected were areas that were associated with decision-making, emotion processing, and potentially emotion regulation. And they were changed in such a way that the kids that were engaged in more screen media activity had already more mature characteristics in those brain areas. And what that means is that typically in a maturing brain, you get a thinning of the gray matter. It's just part of what normally happens. And that seemed to have been accelerated. And that acceleration and maybe the disproportionate acceleration of certain brain areas could have contributed. These are all speculations. Now, in the meantime, and I know I don't have much of the time, but we did a bunch of follow-up studies with a statistician to look at the longitudinal data, because now we have, of course, longitudinal data that allows us to look a little bit more, well, what happens when we see changes. And so we did, again, now looking at the longitudinal data. I just want to show you a little bit data, because I know we have, how much do I have left? Now, okay. That's good to know. I mean, so let me just show you this in the next slide. So this was a study that we did where we basically looked at a total screen time at baseline. Oops. Yeah, okay. Total screen time at baseline, and then looked at internalizing behavior, which is anxiety, depression, 2 years later. And then we asked the question, were there any screen media activity related brain changes that predicted the degree of internalizing behavior? And lo and behold, what you see here in blue, it's a little different rendering, were the brain areas that were involved and that mediated the effect on future internalizing behavior, meaning more anxiety, more depression. So yes, we did find a relationship. Yes, there were certain areas that were related to more internalized behavior, but once again, the important element here is the effect sizes are extremely small. So we're not talking about that it's wiping out your brain and you feel depressed in the future. It's just very tiny effects. But what we didn't, and what we're now doing, and I'm stopping, is while the average effect size is small, that does not mean that the effect size could not be quite substantial for certain people with certain characteristics, and that's what we're looking at. And I've had a whole bunch more to show you, but I'm running out of time, and I'm hoping we have a nice discussion at the very end. Thank you.
I think think we will go to the next one and then we'll get a
Yes.
local discussion.
Yes, so please save your questions
Yeah.
until the very
So-
end after the good talks.
I want to next introduce you to Dr. Steffen Sammet, who is an actually a doctor because he's both MD and PhD. And I don't even know what DABR, DABMRS, but medical physics is also in his background. He's a professor of radiology and medical physics at the University of Chicago. He's the director of the clinical magnetic resonance physics and the associate program director of the clinical imaging medical physics residency programs at the University of Chicago Medical Center. So it's also the education part of residency part. He also holds adjunct faculty positions in the Department of Radiology and the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences at the Ohio State University. He completed his graduate studies in physics at the University of Heidelberg and a master's with magna cum laude and distinction in his PhD. And following his PhD, he completed his medical degree, and his current research interests include development of new methodologies in high and ultra-high field magnetic resonance imaging, as well as magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So I'm gonna over to you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. It's very nice and kind of you, and thank you so much for inviting me. I was very excited to come here to see the new building, and it's amazing. You will see it tonight, and we will see the opening of the MR. It's really cool. You will love it. So I try to go as fast as I can so that you can see more of the MRI that you have here on site. So we have also an MRI research center at the University of Chicago, and we have two dedicated MR scanners. One is a smaller bore system that is used by psychiatry and psychology that Dr. Paulus has already introduced, and we use a lot of fMRI. But we have also a larger bore system, which is a 70 centimeter bore that we use for interventional studies. And I want to introduce you today to a special kind of intervention that is MRI-guided HIFU. So we use our MRI scanner to guide high-intensity focused ultrasound. You might know ultrasound as a diagnostic tool for scanning. You have maybe experienced it yourself. So ultrasound waves are mechanical longitudinal pressure waves at a frequency above 20 kilohertz. And you can use these waves now for ultrasound imaging. And the diagnostic ultrasound range is normally in the range between 5 and 20 megahertz. But you can also use these waves for other applications. There's maybe industrial application as cleaning and plastic welding and bacterial water purification. But what I want to show you today is that we can use these waves also therapeutically. So we can use these waves in a way that we focus them in the human body to ablate tissue. And for the therapeutic ultrasound, the frequency is normally in the range of 1 to 4 megahertz. And this is called high-intensity focused ultrasound, or HIFU. And it's a medical procedure that uses now this high-intensity focused sonic waves, and we locally heat and destroy diseased tissue. HIFU is a hypothermia therapy that uses the temperature to treat the disease. So we try to heat up the tissue. And there's also other ultrasound treatments methods like ultrasound-assisted drug delivery. I will show you a little bit later about it. We have hemostasis, we have lithotripsy, and ultrasound-assisted thrombolysis. How does it work? Well, you can see here, HIFU therapy uses a localized focus of high-intensity focused ultrasound, and the temperature rise is linear dependent on the local HIFU intensity. The first publication was actually already in 1942. And you can see we focus now the ultrasound from the transducer in the tissue, and we create a very high acoustic pressure in the tissue and destroy it then. Here's the difference between diagnostic ultrasound and therapeutic ultrasound. So in diagnostic ultrasound, we use very short ultrasound bursts of a few microseconds. Therapeutic ultrasound, HIFU, uses a continuous wave, and we apply a lot of pressure here, 1 to 10 megapascals, and intensities of 500 to 5,000 watt per square centimeter. How does it work now in the tissue? So we have the ultrasound wave entering the body. We have vibration of the molecules and an energy absorption, and then a temperature elevation, and at the end, a tissue coagulation. So we cause a denaturation of the tissue. you as the scientist and engineer, I thought you would love that, so I put it down. Equation, and it determines now the temperature rise that is introduced by HIFU. And for the localized focus, the temperature rise will also be slightly spread by heat conduction and heat diffusion. And you can see there are many tissue parameters that contribute now. So we have the tissue temperature, we have the perfusion, we have the absorption and so on that contribute now to the temperature rise. So different tissues will behave differently to the ultrasound beam. And what we try to achieve is a thermal necrosis, here shown in red. So we have to elevate the temperature to a certain level to reach the coagulation limit. Normally the protein denaturation is here around 56 degrees Celsius, but you can also achieve it by applying longer pulses to heat the tissue up. So if very short pulses, we have to reach at least a temperature of 56. But then if you can see here, we can achieve it also by applying longer pulses and heating the tissue over a longer time with the lower temperature. So an important difference between HIFU and other forms of focused energy, such as radiation therapy and radiosurgery, is that the passage of the ultrasound energy through the tissue is not cumulative. So we can repeat the treatment. So if there's maybe a repeat treatment failure of a patient with radiation therapy, we can use HIFU and maybe ablate the tissue and the tumor then. And it's a non-ionizing treatment, so the option to treat cancer recurrence after radiation therapy failure is great.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Why did you say, correct me, why did you say it's not cumulative? You're sending pulses, right?
Right.
So what is an example of cumulative? Like radiation is cumulative?
Radiation. The problem is you have to limit the radiation to the body. So in focused ultrasound, you have only the heating in the tissue, but you don't have any effects to the tissue that will be penetrated. So only in the focus spot you will have the effect. But in radiation therapy, you also damage part of the tissue that's in the beam path.
Thank you.
For HIFU, we need some kind of image guidance, and we use ultrasound guidance. This is called ultrasound-guided HIFU, but more modern is now MRI-guided HIFU. So you use an MRI scanner, we put the patient inside, and then we can use the images of MRI and see how the treatment works. And there's multiple possibilities, and I will show that how it works. And the first publication was already in 1992. So it's an established method for different diseases. This is ultrasound guidance. You see here a uterine fibroid. And then we use now the HIFU to treat the uterine fibroid. This is a CT image, computed tomography that uses X-rays. And this is an MRI image. And you can see the difference between the MRI image and the CT image. The soft tissue contrast is really beautiful in MRI. So you see the different tissues in different contrast. And you see here the uterine fibroid. And you can see then the treatment effects after the uterine fibroid was treated. You can see here the setup. So we put the patient on the tabletop. There's the lesion that we try to treat. We have a special mirror system, an ultrasound mirror system that is under the patient, in the patient table, so it's embedded. And then we move the patient inside the bore and try to move the patient exactly in the isocenter of the bore, because the image quality of the MRI is best in the isocenter. And then we start the treatment with the HIFU pulses.
What does the mirror do?
What?
You said that you have a mirror below the patient?
So it's a mirror system. It's a mirror that is used to focus the ultrasound beam. So we have multiple small elements that will focus now the ultrasound beam in the tissues. And it's basically focused in a way. I will show that how it works in a second. So we focus the ultrasound by giving different phases to the different mirror elements that we use. I will show you. The MRI-guided HIFU therapy is based on local hyperthermia, and you can see here nicely, we can now define the volume that we want to treat, and the computer calculates then the treatment volume, the treatment time, similar to radiation therapy. So we have an MRI with a HIFU device here embedded in the MRI table. Then we have a 3D anatomical scanning, so we scan like in a regular MRI suite. And we also have additional temperature mapping. So we try to determine how high is the temperature in a certain tissue. And then it goes to the ultrasound driving system, and you can see here, this is what I talked about. This is basically the phased array transducer that we use now in the patient table, and you can use the steering to locate the beam in different locations. Here's the setup again. Patient for the uterine fibroid treatment is laying prone because it's easier than to reach the tissue in the human body. And here's the integrated system of the HIFU transducer and the MRI coils. And here you can see another example how the system looks like. So the temperature rise can be measured with several MRI methods, and that's the beauty about MRI. There's a lot of functional possibilities in MRI. And one is the spin density, the T1 constant, diffusion coefficient, and the water proton resonance frequency. And this is what we will use now, and I will show you how that works. So we look at the phase shift of the water proton resonance frequency and use that to determine is there a temperature rise. So this is the proton resonancy shift measurement. You can see that here. The MRI signal is a complex signal. So it has a real part and has an imaginary part, but we can also use now the phase and the magnitude of the signal. So what you can see here is a typical magnitude image of the MRI, and here is a typical phase image of the MRI.
Do you use the phase image?
We use multiple phase images. I will show you how that works over time. So we acquire at the same time magnitude and phase images, and out of the change of the phase, we can calculate a temperature change, which is shown here. So the temperature change, or the change over time in the temperature, is proportional to the phase shift. And this phase shift we can now determine by looking at these parameters that also are important in MRI. We have the gyromagnetic ratio of 42.5 megahertz per Tesla. And then we have here the MRI parameters, the echo time, and the magnetic field, 1.5 normally for the treatments. We use the 3T system because it gives a little bit higher signal to noise ratio, but it's often difficult with studies to use it, because if you use cardiac studies or so, there's a lot of motion artifacts and susceptibility artifacts that might be stronger. But we were pretty successful using our 3T system for HIFU treatment. And here I can show you how it looks like. This is a phase image before the heating. This is a phase image after the heating. And then we just basically subtract the phase images that are acquired at different time points. And you can then see here, we can color code it and determine the heat in different colors. This is this equation here again. But we don't do this only in one slice, we do it in multiple slices. And you can see that here, so we have 3 slices that determine now the temperature. We can also angulate the slices, which is also another beauty of MRI. In CT imaging, we can only acquire axial slices. In MRI, we can use any direction of the slices. You can see here, this is how it looks like, the multi-slice monitoring of the temperature mapping using the phase images overlaid on the anatomical images. And you can see here then the area that was heated in different color coding. Problems are, of course, there might be a baseline drift. So the magnetic field drifts over time. So it's not permanently stable. So you have to do some corrections. And there's also motion. The patient motion is maybe the most important. So we have to be very careful that the machine is set up. If the patient moves too much, the scanning will be interrupted and the treatment will be interrupted. The accumulated temperature over time is described here. So normally we need tissue effects, and that depend on the temperature and time, as I mentioned before. And the tissue necrosis at 43 degrees Celsius needs about 240 minutes of heating. So it would be extremely long. You can also go down and just heat for 1 second at 57 degrees, or you can then go up depending on how long you heat the tissue up and achieve a similar effect. And this is called equivalent minutes. So you can describe now how many minutes do I need to achieve the similar effect, like at 1 second at 57 degrees, so you need maybe much longer at lower temperatures. And you can see here nicely, This is the temperature map here. So this is the elevation of the temperature. And then we can use, like in radiation therapy, also the dose map. So how much energy did we apply? How much heating did we apply in a certain location? And that gives us a map then. And the thermal dose is calculated according to the Arrhenius equation, and we can then calculate now these temperature maps. These are the 240 equivalent minutes, and this is commonly defined to indicate a full and irreversible coagulative necrosis in muscle tissue. The 30 EM is often taken as a threshold for the onset of thermal damage, so we have to be careful. We have to spare the other organs around it, so we should not exceed it. You can see that here. So 0 to 30, no thermal damage. If we go above and somewhere in between 240, we have possible thermal damage. And then as soon as we reach the 240 equivalent minutes, we have an irreversible coagulative necrosis, what we want to, of course, achieve in a tumor to ablate a tumor. We have to be careful, of course. HIFU may also occlude the blood vessels if they're in the pathway. So there's a lot of things we have to be careful when we do the treatment. Here's again the map that I just described. So we need basically to be here somehow in this red region to achieve a successful treatment of cancer or any lesion that we try to treat. And this is the thermal dose threshold here. So we have to be careful that we don't damage the surrounding tissue. This is a typical thermal map and a thermal dose map. On the left side is the thermal map, on the right side is the thermal dose map. And this is what we achieved now in muscle tissue. You can nicely see the coagulative effect here, and then here in the rim there is already some damage, but you can really nicely focus now the ultrasound beam to achieve this macroscopic effect. We have real-time feedback in our MRI scanner, so we calculate permanently these thermal maps and the dose maps. Then we have the visualization on the screen. We can see what happens. And then once we heated up the tissue to 240 equivalent minutes, we stop the heating, and then we have a predictable necrosis volume. And you can nicely see after the scan, after the treatment, there is in the MRI image also the treatment effect visible. Then we can see here again our temperature maps in color coding, and then we have the isodose contour lines like in radiation therapy. So we have here the orange for 30 equivalent minutes, and then the white one describes the necrosis in the tissue. The ultrasound beam can be focused in a small focal zone, either by using a lens, a curved array transducer, a phased array transducer, or any combination of the three. This is what the question that you were asking, so how does it work? And this is shown here. So there's the ultrasound system. These are 256 small transducer elements, and you can basically steer them independently and treat the tissue then by applying now ultrasound pulses. These are the 256 elements, and we can use now an electronic displacement and the fast electronic switching to activate one of these elements. And you can see then here, we can apply a phase difference of the ultrasound pulses, and then we successfully can steer now the ultrasound beam in the tissue with all these different elements that you can see here. This is a typical HIFU transducer. It has a power output of up to 150 watts and frequencies from 1 to 10 megahertz. The frequency is low because we want to penetrate deep in the tissue. You can see here there's also testing phantoms to see how successful you can apply the ultrasound pulse. This is the treatment of the tissue mimicking phantom, and you can see nicely the area that can be treated. This is normally what we apply before we use the ultrasound on a patient. So we can do a pressure calculation in the tissue mimicking gel and calculate how high was the pressure at a certain location by looking at the coagulation effects that we see here. Here's a photo of the tabletop transducer again. So this is the MRI patient table. Here's the HIFU transducer, and then we can see that we can use this now for the treatment of the tissue. There are different ways of ablating now the tissue. We can do it point by point, which takes a very long time, of course. Or we can use volumetric heating by asking the machine basically to do a volumetric scan over this area that we are interested in. They have all kinds of advantages and disadvantages. I don't want to go too much in detail, but one of them takes very long. The other one is faster, but is maybe not as precise as the point-by-point treatment. And you can see here now, this is one of the steering methods. So we start in the center and then we go outwards to treat the tissue in certain locations. Okay, let me jump over that. So at the end, we have basically now created the thermal maps, the dose map. We have a real-time visualization, and then we can stop the heating once we think, okay, this tissue, we treated well, and there is no possibility after the necrosis was achieved. This is how it looks like in real life. This is the MRI scanner here on the right-hand side. This is the MRI patient table. It looks exactly like a regular table. The only difference is there's the HIFU transducer inside, and the patient is then positioned on the HIFU table and moved inside the bore of the MRI scanner. There are many clinical applications. I don't want to read them all, but you can see there's so many possibilities. For bone metastasis, there's even reimbursement in the US now. A lot of the other ones are just in development. So there's cardiovascular application, gastrointestinal, and also in the brain. And there's a lot going on also at our university. We use HIFU now for essential tremor and ablate in the brain now different areas that are suspected to have caused the disease. I want to show you just a few examples because that was one of the larger studies that we ran out on our hospital. That's the application in uterine fibroids. You can see here a typical uterine fibroid, very big, and that is before treatment. And here on the right-hand side, you can see the treatment effect. So you achieve here necrosis, and after a while, the tissue will collapse, and this is basically just fluid here at the moment. And then the uterine fibroid will shrink. You can then repeat the treatment because it has no cumulative effect to the surrounding tissue, and you can see how the treatment was working. Here's another example of the intra-treatment measurements or the temperature maps that we use to determine the necrosis. And then I mentioned already, we also do functional neurosurgery at the University of Chicago. We use now this technique to treat various brain diseases like essential tremor, Parkinson's disease, and this was very well established now, and we are pretty successful in treating patients. What I was working just recently on is the delivery of drugs. And one idea is that we have drugs that will burst open when there's a high enough acoustic pressure, or they burst open if there's high enough temperature. And I will show you some examples. So we can use this now to deliver drugs, because in the brain and in brain tumors, it's often not easy to deliver drugs to the tumor. In cancers, it has been already successfully shown success in China, and there's a lot of studies going on all over the world in Israel and other sites, and we will see this maybe more and more also in the US in the future. My focus in this research that I want to show you here was prostate cancer, and the idea is that we can hopefully treat prostate cancer better without cutting the neurovascular bundle, what is often a problem then, with impotence and incontinence. And the idea is that we use ultrasound and focus the ultrasound into prostate of patients that have maybe early stage prostate cancer and can be easily treated with a non-invasive technique. And this is how it normally looks like. The patient lays on the side and there's an ultrasound transducer that will be inserted transrectally, and then we can apply the ultrasound beam inside the prostate. But you can see here already, we might also damage tissue on the beam path. So we have to be careful. And the idea was that we develop now maybe a method that will save the patient because there's often some side effects in the prostate sphincter and so on. I don't want to go too much in detail, but the idea, and I was working with Philips Healthcare on that, we try to get rid of the transrectal transducer and we try to introduce a transurethral transducer. This was one of the first prototypes. It was very rigid. Now it's a very flexible transducer that you can insert in the urethra of the patient, and you can then turn it around. And there are multiple elements that you can use for HIFU treatment of the prostate. So you stick it basically in the urethra, turn it around, and move it then over time and ablate the tissue. Then you don't have the side effects of the bladder, you don't have the side effect of the rectum. You can see here the typical setup. This is the HIFU transducer. It has 8 elements along this beam here. And it's a tabletop transducer, and we use it first of all in animals. We haven't used this in patients yet, but it will come in the near future with a very flexible transducer. This was the transducer here. You can see it nicely. It's basically a small robot that can turn around in the prostate of the patient, and we can activate the different elements depending on how we want to treat the different areas in the prostate. We have to use cooling with degassed water because the system would otherwise overheat. I ran a canine study with my graduate student here because the canine prostate is very similar to the human prostate, and it responds very similar also to the treatment of ultrasound. And so we positioned now the canine here in our MRI scanner. And you can see here the coil. It's an abdominal coil that's placed on top of the canine. We insert now the small HIFU transducer inside the urethra of the dog, and then we turned it around and ablate it in different areas. And you can see nicely there is now the real-time imaging study that we run for the temperature mapping and the dose mapping. And in different areas, this is now the prostate here and coronal view, you can see we can heat up the tissue pretty much very precisely. And then at the end, we calculated the dose images and the dose maps and did a histopathological correlation. And you can nicely see in the MRI contrast enhanced image afterwards, there's a nice treatment effect, very localized. This is the histopathological slide, and then the correlation to the temperature dose map that we have calculated. So it was quite successful. Then we treated in different areas just to see how flexible is it, how easy is it to turn, and we were very successful with delivering the HIFU pulses in different parts of the prostate. What I wanted to show you at the very end now is we also tried to deliver drugs now to the prostate. In addition to the HIFU treatment, the ablation treatment, we also wanted to deliver drugs that are sensitive now for prostate cancer. And the idea is that we have to open now these small vesicles that we inject in the bloodstream, and the HIFU pulses open them. And this is called HIFU-mediated drug delivery. So we have to achieve a certain temperature that the vesicles open and go inside the prostate tissue and kill the cancer cells, but spare the surrounding regions. We have here the tumor. We inject now the drugs, and the drugs are sensitive to the HIFU pulses. It can be either sensitive to the temperature rise, or it can be sensitive to the acoustic pressure. And then you deliver now the small drug vesicles inside the prostate, and to prove that we are really inside the prostate, we loaded them additionally with gadolinium contrast agents to see that we have the effect inside the prostate. Let's jump over that. So you can see here nicely, this is a post-HIFU treatment, and the gadolinium is accumulated in the tissue in a certain area, and with the proteins, this is one of the gadolinium contrast agents. So that is for us an indicator the drug was also in this location. Jump over that. There's of course at the very end, I want to show you some limitations. We have problems with HIFU as well as we have in diagnostic ultrasound, especially when there are bones, metallic objects like implants, if there's air spaces, scar tissue. So we have to consider this all in our calculations and treatment modifications before we start scanning the patient. So ultrasound cannot propagate in air, you know that already maybe from other studies, but the reflected beam is also a problem. So we have to be careful because if there's air bubbles, if there's metal, then you might see some reflections that damage the tissue in the area. And at the very end, there's another example that I want to show you. We can use the ultrasound, as I mentioned, to heat up the tissue. But there's another idea that we can also use the acoustic pressure to destroy the tissue. And this is the cavitation effect that we use here. So we basically create enough energy and oscillations of small microbubbles that will then occur in the tissue, and when they burst, they will basically ablate the tissue. So we don't use the thermal effect of ultrasound, we use the cavitational effect. Cavitational effects you might know from boats that you see some damages here on the propeller when it turns very fast. And a similar effect we can see when we have high enough acoustic pressures in ultrasound, we can achieve that too. And this cavitation effect is of course dangerous. We have to be careful how we use it. But there were some successful studies, and one of our assistant professors here at the University of Chicago, he developed now a histotripsy technique where he tries with the shock waves to destroy now tissue. This is a tissue example, so it's a little bit different what we have done with the thermal heating, but it works very similar. So you have the small microbubbles that occur in the tissue, and then these microbubbles basically destroy the surrounding tissue that you can see here. Okay, then as a summary, I think I'm almost on time. I want to show you here that we can use high-intensity focused ultrasound to treat locally the tissue that might be diseased, and hopefully only this tissue. We use temperature mapping and controls for the HIFU treatment. And then I wanted to show you at the very end that we can also use maybe HIFU to open blood vessels or destroy tumors by delivering drugs in certain locations. All right, stop here, and then I think we can walk on.